I think that it's important to start to trace out how the bank and fund actually engineer societies.
Yeah.
Okay, so what they do is they offer the loan, and then and this was very traditional of the IMF since inception, and of the World Bank since about 1980. Is what they do is they basically offer the loan with conditions. It's not just the fact that, and we'll talk about credit, but like it's not just the fact that they're making a loan which is perceived as charity by us, but then we forget the very simple fact that when you make a loan, the borrower has to pay back principal plus interest. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that they're like benefiting from these countries, right? Like these aren't gifts; these are loans. Often at like back in the 60s and 70s, and we're talking 6, 7, 8% interest. And the bank and fund would borrow the money from international capital markets and from creditor nations at 5%, and then they would sell the money to poor countries at 8%. Like they'd make money off a spread.
Their spread.
Yeah, of course. Like that's how they finance themselves, which people also don't like to think about. They think these are like, again, charitable, gift-giving institutions. It's just not the case. But in any event, like these loans are given out with conditions, upon conditions. This is called structural adjustment. So basically the goal of structural adjustment is to change the society of a poor country to make it focus on exports at the expense of consumption. So I'll give you an example. A really good example is what I'm gonna lead my new essay with that's coming out soon. By the time that folks are hearing our interview, hopefully the essay will be out. And we'll talk about Bangladesh. This is a very poor country. It suffered a lot in the last 100 years, both through natural disaster and human disaster. I mean, the British basically caused a massive famine in Bangladesh and during World War II, killed 3 million people. A lot of people attribute this to Churchill and to Keynes, actually. They suffered again in the 70s. They had another massive famine that the US government was actually part of. The Bangladeshis were selling what's called jute, which makes burlap, like it makes bags. Like jute is like a fiber, and it can make bags, and sack grain bags, things like that. They were selling that to the Cubans and the Soviets. So the US didn't like that very much. And we controlled kind of like the world's wheat production. So they started to have a famine, and we like didn't allow the wheat to go in. And like 1 million people died. And the US was partially responsible for that. So they've had a lot of rough crises. They also get hit by these insane cyclones that killed up to 1 million people at a time. Basically, the bay that the Bangladesh sits at the top of is shaped like a tunnel, and the cyclones come in and they just pick up power and steam, and then they just wreck this country, which has a lot of like low-lying, like wet land around it. So it's a poor country that had been just devastated over and over again by natural and man-made issues. And you had people doing essentially subsistence farming. Like they were poor, but they could generally feed themselves. Usually, they were growing cattle and rice and things to eat. Okay, but that's not very good for paying debt back, right? So, if you have the bank and fund loaning you money for stuff, that government has to find a way to pay the debt back. So the way that it would work is that the bank and the fund would come into these countries and try to structure them so that they could earn more money. And they're not a reserve currency nation. They create their own fiat, right?
Hold on. So this is to encourage them to increase their exports so they could repay the loans.
Yes, exactly. So they could pay back debts.
Even though this might not be structurally good for the country.
It's horrible for the country, as we'll get into. But it's a very simple idea. Like if Bangladesh wants to buy tractors from Britain or from the United States, from the international markets, it can't use its own currency because the Bangladeshi currency is not convertible around the world. The only way it can buy tractors or grain or whatever
with dollar loans
is by borrowing, but mainly by exporting goods, and then they receive hard currency in return.
Yeah.
So
okay.
The point of these programs was to make governments like Bangladesh able to export more so they could get more hard currency so they could pay back the loans, which are dollar-denominated loans.
So does that focus in productivity on producing things that other markets require at the expense of what domestically they require?
You've hit the nail on the head.
So you destroy farming?
Yeah.
Is this kind of what's been happening in Sri Lanka?
Well, just to focus on Bangladesh, like the point is they weren't farming the right things for the international markets. So the World Bank and IMF came in and they said, you guys should grow shrimp. Shrimp is very lucrative. There are shrimp that are infinite numbers of shrimp swimming around this tropical bay that's next to Bangladesh. So the bank said to the Bangladeshi government, which of course was an autocratic government, and that's kind of such an important thread of this whole story, is that almost always the money that was borrowed by these governments was borrowed by a dictator or by at least an unaccountable corrupt government.
Because it's a lot easier.
Exactly.
And the incentives are there for them to maintain power.
Yeah, like if you're lending to a democracy with free speech, the people are going to protest against the IMF policies because they lead to like horrible social conditions.
But also, it comes back to, it's even a time preference argument. You got a dictator, you're offering them a whole bunch of money.
Oh, because they don't care about 20 years from now.
And they corrupt and they can steal and they can have their parties in their
They take 20% off the top.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Drink champagne, smoke cigars.
So these dictators and these military dictators in Bangladesh are like, okay, yeah, I mean, we'll take the money, we'll make you guys some shrimp. So again, this is a society that's been devastated by these cyclones. So they had built these dikes. They hired the Dutch in the 60s to build these dikes, these big like dirt and rock structures to help prevent the waves from coming in. The waves are, very, very deadly. So because of the imposition of these new policies, these farmers were now encouraged to take their fields where they were growing food that they could eat and drill holes in the dikes and fill their fields with salt water and then go into the ocean and catch the young shrimp and then bring the shrimp into their fields and like basically farm the shrimp there. And then they would once the shrimp are ready to eat, they would sell it to these shrimp lords who then give them to the government. And then they end up on our plate in Britain and the United States and Japan. We end up eating the shrimp. The key part is that you're sacrificing local consumption for export. So we're changing the energy of the nation from creating stuff for it to eat for us to eat.
It's like a subtle, insidious form of slavery.
It's pretty bad.
It's like, here is a loan. Well, the way we get you to pay that off is get you to produce things that export. It's a real subtle, insidious form of slavery. The
reason why the Bangladesh example is so powerful is, number one, you start to realize that these loans were made to change societies so that they would feed us in rich countries or fuel us in rich countries, at the expense of local human rights and development concerns, and there are also usually devastating environmental effects. So I guess what I'm talking about. So now you have these cyclones coming in, and the defense mechanisms which had been built to protect people were had holes in them now. So they were not as nearly as effective anymore. And what's even more troubling is that traditionally the way that people would be protected by the cyclones, because Mother Nature usually has a plan, are the world's largest mangrove forests are there, okay? And they're very, very good. Mangrove forests are very, very good at protecting people. So to build the shrimp farms, they cut down, I don't know what the exact number is today, but by the 90s, they had cut down almost half of all the mangrove forests in this region to do shrimp farming. So not only are you putting holes in the man-made protections, you're also getting rid of the natural protections. So there's massive deforestation. The leaking of the salt water into the farmland has destroyed the rivers and any sort of natural life that lives there, because everything's now salt. It's salt kills, right? They've made other farming nearby very unproductive, because when you have chickens or cows or you're growing something and there's just a lot of salt in the general area, it hurts and kills things. So it's made this whole area much less productive, with the exception of making shrimp. And what you have is environmental destruction, and you have a reduction of a population that was poor, but at least could feed itself, now downgrading to a population that's also very poor and needs to go to the market to buy food. So now they're dependent on imports from rich countries. This is the whole game. So we make these poor countries focus on exporting raw goods, whether it be oil or gold or cotton or palm oil or tea or coffee or shrimp. Usually, by the way, things no one can eat. If you think about it, it's kind of sinister. It's usually stuff that you can't eat, or it's not meant for them. Like, it's not like these poor Bangladeshis who are making like $1 a day and work 12 hours a day, and there's enormous amounts of child labor involved in this, by the way. They're not eating the shrimp. No, they're like selling the shrimp, and then the individuals, by the way, the serfs, the shrimp serfs, they are taking on debt to change their farm into a shrimp farm. And after a decade, they may not even make all the money back that they owe. So they're in like debt bondage, okay? Meanwhile, the shrimp lords and the government are making a freaking killing. Today, as we speak, shrimp is the second largest export of Bangladesh. So it's completely changed the country in this way. And dude, it's pretty devastating. And that's just like an example. This is called aquaculture. The World Bank has also funded this in so many other countries. In India, along the western coast of Latin America, like you'll see all these shrimp farms. These are operations that do not benefit the local population, that deliver hard currency to usually unelected, unaccountable rulers who spend it on weapons, guns, paying back debt, and buying palaces and collections of cars and wine and things like that. It's really devastating to the local population.